Vale, pues nada, en primer lugar,
All right,
el
well,
agradecerles
first of all, thank you for being
que se
connected
puedan ser
here,
conectados,
okay?
¿vale?
To talk a little about
Para
Talend and
explicar un
data
poco
governance and
el
what can
tema de
be done
Talend
with the
y lo
tool
que es
and the
el dato y
possibilities
lo
it
que se puede
offers.
hacer con la herramienta
From
y
my
las
side,
posibilidades
I'm
que
Juan
da.
Fernandez, Project Director at
Por mi parte,
Stratabuy,
soy
and
Juan
my colleague
Fernández,
Raul
director de
Barbero is
proyectos
also here.
de Stratevi y está mi compañero Raúl Barbero también.
And well,
Y
the
bueno, la
idea
idea
is,
es
during this
durante
approximately
los
hour and a
minutos
half,
simplemente pues
we'll be able to show you
que
possibilities
podamos
of the
enseñar
tool as we were
posibilidades
saying.
de la
First,
herramienta,
we'll start with
como
an
decíamos.
introduction and
En primer
briefly
lugar,
tell you about a
empezaremos
project we've implemented
haciendo una
with the tool to
introducción
serve as an introduction to
y
situate
contando
ourselves.
brevemente
Then we'll look at an
haciendo
overview
un
of the
resumen
talent architecture without
los
going into too
proyectos
much
que hemos
detail.
implementado con la herramienta para que sirva un poco de introducción para situarnos. Veremos luego una parte de arquitectura de Talend, sin entrar muy en detalle, ¿vale? Pues
Okay?
si hay perfiles
If there are
heterogéneos de usuarios de
heterogeneous
negocio
profiles
y
of
de usuarios
business
más
users and
técnicos,
more technical
entiendo un
users,
poco que
which I
lo que,
understand is
lo
what
que
we
solemos
usually
tener,
have to
pues
serve as an
para que
introduction
sirva
point,
de punto
but without getting
de
too
introducción, pero
technical
sin
and
entrar
causing anyone to get lost,
muy en el
right?
plano técnico
Then
y que
we'll
haya
also discuss an
alguna cosa pues, que se
overview of
pueda
the
aprender.
Talent Cloud, the possibilities it offers.
Luego comentaremos también un overview de la parte de Talent Cloud, de las posibilidades que ofrece.
We'll
Entraremos
also
también en la
delve into
parte
the data
de
governance
gobierno
part with Talent and
del
the
dato
different modules
con
they have
Talent
to
y
apply
los
best
diferentes módulos
practices
que
in
tiene
data
para
governance
poder
policies. And
aplicar
then the idea
buenas
is to both
prácticas
discuss
y
with you
poder
and
usar el
show you
gobierno del
some
dato.
practical cases.
Y luego
Okay,
también la
we'll show
idea
you
es
some practical cases that can be
tanto hacer
developed
con
because
vosotros
Talent's
como
idea is to
enseñaros
expand not only to
un
technical
caso
users but
práctico,
also to more
¿vale? Os enseñaremos
business-oriented
un
user
caso
profiles.
práctico
So it's about showing you those
que se
tools
puede
that give us those
desarrollar
possibilities with
y
Talent.
porque la idea de Talent es extenderse no solo a usuarios técnicos, sino también a perfiles de usuario más de negocio. Entonces, enseñaros esas herramientas que nos dan esas posibilidades con Talent.
And
Y
we've also sent you some
también le
Salesforce
enviamos
accounts to
una
do an
serie
exercise, a use case,
de
so you can see
cuentas
a bit of the
de
tool in
Salesforce
action
para
with
hacer
this use
un
case. So
ejercicio,
if you've
un caso de
downloaded the
uso
tool and have it
para
ready,
que puedan ver un
perfect.
poco la herramienta.
And
Este
if
caso de
not,
uso, pues,
well, we can show it to
si
you
se
so
han
you can
descargado la
see what the
herramienta
working
y
process
lo
with
tienen
Talent would
preparado,
be like,
perfecto, y si no, pues
okay?
bueno, se lo podemos enseñar para que vean un poco cómo sería el proceso de trabajo con Talent, ¿vale? Y la idea
And
de
the
dejar al
idea
final
is to
pues
leave some time
un
at
turno
the end for
de preguntas,
questions,
un
a
tiempo en el
time
que
in
podamos
which we can
contestar
answer any questions,
alguna cuestión,
okay?
¿vale? Pues
So I'm
voy a
going to
empezar
start
compartiendo
sharing my
pantalla.
screen. Well,
Bueno,
as I
como
was
les decía,
saying,
¿no? De
at
Strategy
Stratabuy we are a
somos,
Talent Gold
somos
partner and we have a
co-hacedores
series of certifications with the
de
tool
Talent
from
y
different
bueno,
projects
tenemos una
we've
serie
undertaken and
de
within the
certificaciones
references or sectors,
con
clients,
la,
right?
con la herramienta de diferentes proyectos que hemos abordado. Y dentro de las referencias o sectores, clientes, ¿no? Pues aquí sería
Here would be a photo.
una foto, ¿no? Pues hemos trabajado
Well, we've
con
worked with
diferentes
different
tipos
types of companies from
de
different
empresas,
sectors,
de
from the
diferentes
logistics
sectores,
sector
pues
like
del
SIVA,
sector
the
logístico, como
university
sería
field like the
Ceba,
University of
en el
Salamanca,
ámbito
credit
universitario,
companies
con la
like
Universidad de
Cetelum, with the
Salamanca,
government of Spain,
con
in this
compañías
case
de
with the
crédito
Ministry of
como
Finance.
Talend, con el gobierno de España, en este
We've
caso
helped them
con el
develop
Ministerio
different
de Hacienda.
projects with the solution, both in
Le
terms
hemos
of
ayudado
collaboration
a
on projects, as I was saying,
desarrollar
and
pues
in terms of
diferentes
training,
proyectos
right?
con la solución, tanto a nivel de
Teaching
colaboración
them the
en proyectos, como
technology a
decía,
bit.
como a nivel formativo,
Within
¿no?
Talent,
Un poco
the idea
enseñarles
is not only to
la
be a tool
tecnología.
used by very technical profiles, right,
Dentro de
but also
Talent,
to open up,
la idea
as
es
you can see
que
here, to
no solo
different
se puedan
roles within
utilizar
the organization.
perfiles muy técnicos, ¿no? Sino que también se abra, como pueden ver aquí, a diferentes roles dentro de la organización, ¿no?
Right? The typical data
El
steward,
típico
that is,
juez
the
del
person who
dato,
will
¿vale? Es decir,
validate
aquella
for us in a
persona que nos
data
va a validar
conflict which would
dentro
be
de un
the
conflicto
correct
entre
data.
datos cuál sería el dato correcto,
Analysts, business users.
analistas, usuarios de negocio, ¿vale? La idea es que
Okay?
con los diferentes módulos que
The
nos
idea is
proporciona,
that
pues
with the different modules
esto
it
que está muy de
provides,
moda, ¿no? De
this,
decir, de
which
la
is very
democratización
fashionable,
del
to
dato,
talk
que se
about
extienda
data
un poco a toda la
democratization, can
organización.
extend a bit to the entire
Y luego
organization.
también la posibilidad de
And then also the
implantarlo con las
possibility
diferentes
of
nubes,
deploying it in the different
las
clouds, the
principales
main
más
or best
conocidas,
known
como
ones
Amazon, Google
Amazon, Google, and Microsoft.
Microsoft y
And
luego la
then also
posibilidad
the
también de
possibility of
hacer
doing
despliegues
on-premises deployments
on-premise,
within
¿no?
our
Dentro de nuestra,
infrastructure,
de nuestra
right?
infraestructura. ¿Vale? Dentro de la solución, pues
Within the solution,
tiene
it has different modules,
diferentes módulos,
okay?
¿vale? En una hora y media no nos daría tiempo, obviamente, a mencionarlos todos, pero bueno,
In an
por
hour and a
resumir,
half, obviously, we wouldn't have
lanzar
time
esa
to
idea,
mention
¿no?
them all,
Que no
but
solo es
well,
una
let it serve
plataforma de
as an
integración
idea
de
that it's
datos,
not just a
sino
data
también
integration platform,
que
but
nos
it
da
also gives us
posibilidades de
data
gobierno de
governance or
datos
MDM
tipo ETL,
possibilities to work with real-time or big
posibilidades
data.
de
I mean, the ability
trabajar
to
con
work
real
with a
time, Big
cluster and
Data,
analyze data in real
poder
time.
trabajar con un clúster y- y analizar datos en tiempo, en real time o near real time.
Time Omnia real time
Y
and with different
con diferentes
modules,
módulos
those that
que nos
obviously
permiten
allow us to
monitorizar qué
monitor
está
what's happening,
pasando,
plan what we want
planificar
to
qué
do,
queremos
and
hacer
collaborate
y
between
colaborar
different
entre los
profiles.
diferentes perfiles, ¿no? Vale, aquí viene
Okay,
una
here
pequeña
comes a
foto
small
de los
photo of the different
diferentes módulos.
modules.
La idea es
The idea is that some
algunos
of
de
them,
ellos,
not all,
algunos de
but
ellos
some of
sí
them we can
podamos
show them and at least the
enseñar,
main
¿vale?
ones.
Al menos los principales y
And for
que
you to
sirvan, ¿no?
get
Para
an
haceros
idea
una
of the
idea
tool.
de la herramienta. Bueno, esto va
Well,
más
this is
relacionado
more
con el
related to
licenciamiento.
licensing.
El
The quick
resumen rápido
summary
sería
would
que
be that
Talend tiene una
Talend has an
versión
open
open,
version,
¿vale? Talend
right?
Open Studio, que
Talend
la
Open
licencia nos permite
Studio, which
descargar,
if
poder
licensed
trabajar
allows
con
us to
ella,
download and work with it,
probarla
try it out.
y luego ya
And
si
then if we
queremos
want to
meter
extend the
el
use of
inventario en
Talend
nuestra
in the
aplicación, pues
organization, we
tenemos
have
el
the
tipo entry
entry-level
level,
approach,
que sería
which is a more
la capacidad más
economical option
económica y
oriented
orientada
towards a smaller
a un
number of
menor número de
users.
usuarios. Y si
And if
queremos
we want to
generalizar y
generalize the
extenderlo a
use and
más
extend it
usuarios,
to
pues
more
tenemos
users, then we
el
have
Open
the platform
Platform.
approach, right?
Y
And
ya un
a
poco
bit depending
dependiendo
on the different
de los
modules,
diferentes
the different
módulos
needs
y
we
las
have,
necesidades que
we'll go
tengamos,
with
pues
one
tiraremos
product
con
or another.
un producto u otro, ¿no? ¿Vale?
And
Y luego,
then,
aparte
apart from that platform, there are also a
de esa
series of plugins or
plataforma,
add-ons,
pues
as they
también hay una
call them,
serie
that
de
allow us to
plugins o
extend
add-ons que
certain
llaman ellos,
capabilities,
que nos permiten extender pues ciertas capacidades, ¿no? Pues tener un inventario de nuestros datos,
such as
tener
having an
control de nuestras nubes
inventory of
para
other
gestionar
data,
procesos,
having a cloud environment to
añadidos
manage
que
processes.
se
These are
complementan con
add-ons that
este
complement this
enfoque
platform
de
or entry-level
plataforma o
approach,
de
right?
entry level, ¿no? ¿Vale? Luego la
Then the
parte
part of how we can work with Talend at the
de cómo
infrastructure
podemos
level.
trabajar
We can
con
have our own
Talend
cloud
a
approach
nivel
where we'll develop with a
de
working
infraestructura, pues podemos
environment that
tener
my
un
colleague
enfoque
Raul will show you, which allows us to
propio
design all the data
de nube para
execution
que podamos
processes.
desarrollar con un entorno de trabajo que luego mi compañero Raúl les mostrará, que es el que nos permite diseñar todos los procesos de ejecución de datos.
And once designed,
Y
we'll publish it in
una
the
vez que están
cloud, in the
diseñados,
Talend
pues
cloud,
publicaremos
and we'll be
en
able to, let's
la nube, en
say,
el cloud
carry
de
out the
Talend
whole
y podremos,
orchestration
digamos, hacer
process,
todo el proceso de
monitoring,
orquestación,
etc.
monitorización, etcétera.
This
¿Vale? Este enfoque
purely cloud approach would be to work with different
puramente
data
cloud
sources in the
sería
cloud,
para
but it's
trabajar
more
pues,
common that we have that
diferentes fuentes de
combination,
datos en
both data
cloud,
sources in the
pero
cloud,
lo más
be it
normal
a
es que
database or a
tengamos
file,
esa
whatever we need,
combinación
as
tanto
well as in our
de
own
datos en
infrastructure.
cloud, ya sea base de datos o ficheros o lo que necesitemos, como en nuestra propia infraestructura, ¿no? Es
I
decir,
mean, it will be
bases de
on-premise
datos
data
on-premise
with
con las
which we
cuales
can
pues, nos podemos
connect.
conectar. ¿Vale?
Here
Aquí la
the
diferencia
difference
es
lies in
usando
a
un
key
componente clave,
component, which
que
is
es
either the
el cloud,
cloud
y el que
engine
no
or
es
the remote
realmente.
engine. It
¿Vale?
would be, let's say,
Sería,
like a
digamos, como
gateway,
un
that
gateway, es
is,
decir, un
a
conector
connector that
que
allows us to
permite
extract data from our data
poder
source and
extraer datos
publish
de
it in the
nuestra
Talend
fuente de
cloud.
datos y publicarlas en el cloud de Talend, ¿no? Ese sería un poco el resumen
I don't know, it
de
would be
esa
a bit of
pieza,
the
¿no? De ese
summary of that
componente de Talend.
fundamental piece.
Aquí, como
Here, the
característica
main
principal
feature
de
of
Talend
Talend
respecto a otras
compared
herramientas
to
de
other
integración es
integration
decirles
tools
que
is to
no
tell you
tiene
that it doesn't have a payment for data processing,
pago
but
por
it doesn't
procesamiento de
matter the
datos,
volume
sino
of
que
data being
da igual la
moved. We
volumetría de
will
datos
only
que se
pay for
mueva,
that,
nosotros vamos a
for that
pagar
license, right?
solo
It's an advantage over other
por esa
integration
licencia.
tools where
Aquí
you
una
pay for
ventaja
data
respecto a otras
movement
herramientas de
or volume,
integración donde
right?
se paga por movimiento de datos o volumetría, ¿no? Y ahí ya tenemos que ir hilando un poco
And
más
there we
fino
have to be a
con
bit
los
more
costes, ¿no?
precise with
Para
the
que
costs so
no
that
nos
it
rieste.
doesn't exceed the cost.
Vale, y luego
And
por
then finally in this part,
último, en esta
it's
parte,
also to
pues
tell
también
you
es
that
decirle
we
que
have a
tenemos un
portal
portal
called
que
Adobe.
se llama Todo
For
Bien. Por
example,
ejemplo,
we
recientemente
recently published
publicamos
this
de
post.
entrada. ¿vale? Es este portal,
It's this portal,
tododay.com, y aquí,
todubai.com, and here
pues,
we disseminate
colgamos
quite a bit of
bastante
content about certain
contenido de
technologies.
ciertas tecnologías. En este
In
caso
this
estamos
case,
tratando
we're
Talend,
dealing with Talend,
eh,
but consider it as
como,
a portal where we
digamos, un portal
disseminate
donde
knowledge of
colgamos
tests and use
conocimiento
cases,
de pruebas, de
etc.
casos de uso, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, aquí pueden
Well,
acceder
here you can access
a
certain
cierta
information
información
that
que
complements
complementa,
a bit
pues,
of everything we're advancing, and
todo lo
also
que
in this
vamos
case,
avanzando.
there's a detailed video where
Y
the whole
también hay,
process
en
is
este caso, un
explained a bit.
vídeo detallado donde se explica un poco todo el
In this
proceso, ¿vale?
case,
En
for
este caso,
working
pues,
with
para
APIs
trabajar con
within
Hadoop
Talend.
dentro de Talend, pero
But we
pues
have different
tenemos
types of
ayudas de
material.
diferente tipo. Integración de Talend
Talend
con
integration with
BigQuery,
BigQuery,
buenas
best practices,
prácticas,
introductory
vídeos
videos to
de
get familiar
introducción
with the
para
tool,
familiarizarse con la herramienta, trabajar con
working
bases de
with
datos
columnar
relacionales
databases,
como
like
Vertica,
Vertica.
¿vale? Para
Okay,
trabajar con
working with
Snowflake y
Snowflake to
construir
build a
un data
data
lake en
lake
la
in the
nube,
cloud.
¿vale? Es decir,
I mean, different
diferente contenido
content,
que, bueno,
which, well,
que le
I
invito
invite you to
pueden
access
entrar
and is
y
accessible
está
for
accesible
information, okay?
para informarse, ¿vale? Y luego de la
And then
parte
from the part of even a webinar we've done
uso y
prior to
vuelta que hemos
this is
realizado
also
previamente,
available
también
here in
pues
this
está
material.
disponible aquí en este material. Lo que hemos
What
hecho con
we've done
algunos
with some of our clients.
de nuestros clientes,
Okay,
¿vale? Pues con la
all right.
solución hemos trabajado con
With the
problemas de
solution,
diferente
we have dealt
tipo,
with different
desde
types of
tratamiento de ficheros
problems
complejos,
related to
como el
handling
caso
complex
de
files,
Talend,
such as the case of Cetalum.
¿vale? Hasta
We have also
pues
tackled other
otros
processes like
procesos como
data
data
quality,
quality, que también hemos
which
abordado
we have
con
also addressed with other clients,
clientes, con Generali,
like Generali,
una
a
financiera con
financial
la que hemos
institution with
desarrollado
whom
pues
we have
también,
assisted in developing
ayudado a
certain
desarrollar
quarterly summaries of accounts and
estos
balances.
resúmenes trimestrales de cuentas y balances, ¿vale? Y
And
luego,
then,
bueno, la
well, the
integración al final se
integration
consuma
ultimately
en una
results in
visualización, ¿no?
visualization,
Y
right?
pues también
Well,
el
Talend
ofrecer
also
pues
offers us
esa
the data
visualización
visualization,
de
right?
datos, ¿no?
Okay.
¿Vale? Y luego a nivel
And then,
formativo,
in
pues
terms
con la
of training,
herramienta
we also offer
también
different types
ofrecemos
of training at
diferentes tipos
different
de
levels with
formación
the tool, okay?
a diferentes niveles, ¿vale? Tanto más básica
Both
para
more basic
introducirse
to introduce oneself to the tool
a
and
la
more
herramienta,
advanced
como
training.
formación más
Well, for
avanzada,
each of the
¿vale?
modules,
Pues
we
de cada
also
uno de los
provide support.
módulos, pues también damos apoyo, ¿vale? Bueno, eso en cuanto a
Well,
una
that's in terms of an
presentación
initial presentation.
así inicial. Quería pasar ahora a entrar así un poco por encima
I
en la
wanted to
parte
now move on to, well, just
de
briefly, the
arquitectura,
architecture part.
¿vale? Al final,
Okay,
un
in the
poco
end, this is
lo que
what
lo
we were
comentaba
talking about
previamente,
a
¿no?
little earlier,
Democratizar el uso
democratizing
del
data
dato.
usage.
Esta parte me la voy a
I'm
saltar
going to
porque
skip this
la hemos
part
visto
because
ya.
we've already seen it.
Bueno, decirles que
Well, it's
también
also advisable to
es
work with
recomendable
Talend's
trabajar
cloud
con la
option
opción
because
cloud
it always
de
ensures
Talend,
automatic
porque siempre
updates
nos
and always
asegura
being on the latest
actualizaciones
version,
automáticas y
which makes
está
our work
siempre en la
much
última
easier.
versión y nos facilita mucho el trabajo, pero también
But
está la
there's also the
posibilidad, como pueden
possibility,
ver aquí,
as
de
you can
trabajar
see
con un
here,
enfoque
to work with an
on-premise dentro
on-premise approach.
de la, de la solución, ¿vale? Es decir, que
Okay,
se pueda
the
ajustar
solution can be
a la
adapted to the
arquitectura
architecture
que más
that
nos
suits us
convenga.
best.
Y en cuanto
And
a
in
extensiones
terms of
de
data
datos, pues ya se
sources,
superan los
well, we already
600
have over
conectores
600 connectors to work
para
with,
trabajar, con lo
so
cual,
we
pues,
practically cover all the data sources we want
prácticamente
to connect
cubrimos
to,
la
both
totalidad
cloud and on-premise.
de fuentes de datos a las que nos queramos conectar, ¿vale? Tanto cloud como on-premise. Vale, aquí a
Okay,
grandes
here,
rasgos, a nivel
broadly speaking,
de
at the
arquitectura,
architecture level,
¿vale?
the key here is to
La prueba quiere
differentiate a
diferenciar
bit
un
that we're
poco que
going to
vamos a
have a part
tener una
locally, that
parte
is, within
de
another
uso
working environment,
local, ¿vale? Es
and
decir,
another
nuestro
part cloud,
entorno de trabajo,
okay?
y otra
Our
parte
part of
cloud,
the working
¿vale? Nuestra
environment that we
parte
manage, the most important one is
de
Talent
entorno de
Studio.
trabajo que nosotros gestionemos, el más importante es el Talent Studio, ¿vale?
Okay?
Como les comentaba,
As I
luego lo veremos
mentioned,
con
we'll
mi
see it
compañero
later
Raúl,
with my colleague
el
Raul,
que nos
which
permite
is what allows
diseñar
us to design and
y orquestar
orchestrate all the
todos los
processes.
procesos. Y luego la
And then
parte
the
del
part
cloud
of
de
the
Talend,
Talent
que
Cloud,
la
which we'll
veremos
see
a
next,
continuación,
well, we'll have a
pues
series of
tendremos una serie
modules
de
to
módulos
monitor
para
and assign
monitorizar,
permissions to users and even
asignar
generate data
permisos
dictionaries from
a
the
usuarios,
articulated itself.
incluso generar diccionarios de datos desde el propio cloud. Vale, voy a silenciar por aquí. Vale.
Okay.
Aquí lo que
Here we
reflejamos es por
reflect,
cada
for each
componente
component,
la
the
arquitectura
architecture it has.
que tiene, ¿vale? Esto les
So
pasaremos
we'll pass you this
este
portfolio and you
portfolio
could consult it in more
usarlo
detail, okay?
más en detalle,
I'm
¿vale?
not
Tampoco
going to go
voy a
into
entrar
each
aquí
piece
pieza por
here,
pieza porque
because it
seguiría
would take
mucho
us too
tiempo,
much time,
pero bueno, la
okay?
clave
But the
es que
key
vamos
is
a
that
tener
we're always
siempre
going to have in our
en
local
nuestro entorno
environment
local la
the
herramienta de
development
desarrollo
tool,
y en el cloud pues publicaremos
and in the cloud,
lo que
we'll
hayamos
publish
diseñado
what we've designed and a bit of
y
what will be
orquestaremos los
the different
diferentes
processes and we'll
procesos y
monitor, etc.
monitorizaremos, etcétera. ¿Vale?
Okay?
Talent Data
Talent
Preparation lo
data
veremos también en la
preparation
demo
will also be
que
seen in the demo we're
les
going to
vamos a
show you.
mostrar. ¿Vale? Y luego aquí
And
sí
then here,
importante la parte
yes, the part
de
of
los
the
engines,
engines,
¿vale?
or as they
Como lo
call it in
llaman
other technologies,
en otras tecnologías un
a
gateway,
gateway.
¿vale? En este
Okay,
caso
in
lo
this
que nos va a
case,
servir es
what will
para
serve us is to be able to, let's say,
poder,
work with our
digamos,
data.
trabajar con nuestros datos. En el
In
caso
the
de la
case
nube,
of the cloud,
con
with the
Cloud
cloud
Engine,
engine,
vamos a
we'll be
poder
able to
definir
define that engine
ese
or that
motor
gateway.
o ese gateway. Y en el
And in the
caso
case of on-premise, what we'll call the remote
de
engine.
on-premise, ¿vale? Lo que llamaremos remote engine, ¿vale? Entonces, bueno,
Well,
un poco
I'll
la
go back a
imagen
bit to
que
the image I
comentaba al
mentioned
inicio,
at the beginning, where
donde
with
con
that
ese Cloud
cloud
Engine
engine
vamos a
we're
poder
going to be able to
trabajar
work with
con
data in the
datos
cloud,
en la nube, ¿vale?
right?
En
In
el
the
caso
event that we want to
de que queramos
combine cloud
combinar
data
datos
with
en la nube
on-premise
con
data
datos
or work
on-premise,
only
como
with
no son
on-premise
datos
data,
on-premise, pues vamos a tener lo que se llama
well, we'll
el
have what's
remote
called the
engine,
remote engine.
¿vale?
So that
Entonces,
remote
ese
engine
remote
will
engine
allow
lo que
us
nos va a
to
permitir
establish communication with those
pues
data
sería
sources and be able
establecer
to work with
una
Talend on them.
comunicación con esos orígenes de datos y poder trabajar
At all times, it will
Talend,
be
¿no? En todo
secure,
momento va a ser
encrypted traffic, and
tráfico
we wouldn't have
seguro,
to worry
cifrado
about those data being in the
y no
cloud,
tendríamos que
right?
preocuparnos de que esos
Because it
datos
was
estén
completely
en la nube,
secured.
¿no? Porque era totalmente securizado, ¿vale? Y bueno, esta
And
sería un
well,
poco
these would be a bit the
las características de
characteristics of
cada
each
uno
of those engines,
de esos engines que ya, bueno, convendría
which,
estudiar
well, it would
el
be
caso que se
advisable
quiere
to study
trabajar
the
para
case you want
determinar
to work on to
con
determine
cuál
which
se
one to
trabaja
work with,
o
or generally,
generalmente
a
se suele hacer una
combination of both is
combinación
usually made, right?
de ambos, ¿no? ¿Vale? Y la foto
And the more
más
general
general de
architecture
arquitectura, pues
photo,
como les decía,
as I
sería
was
esta, ¿no?
saying,
Pues
would be this
un
one,
Cloud
with a
Engine
cloud engine or a remote engine generally,
o un Remote
which gives us
Engine,
more
generalmente que
possibilities,
nos da más posibilidades,
which
que
would be
sería
this
esta foto,
photo here.
¿vale?
Okay?
Hay posibilidades
There are
más
more
avanzadas,
advanced
¿vale?
options,
Si tenemos una
okay?
red privada
If we have a
virtual
virtual private network,
también,
too.
¿vale? En la
In the
nube podemos
cloud,
tener
we
nuestra
can
red
have our
privada
private network and
tener
have all
dentro de
our
esa red
traffic
privada
within that private
todo
network and
nuestro
only have the
tránsito
Talend
y
console for
solo tener la
administration,
consola de
okay?
Talend para administración. ¿Vale? Estas
That
son
is to say,
posibilidades de
we have
arquitectura,
several
tenemos varias
architecture
y
possibilities
bueno,
and well,
dependiendo del
depending
caso,
on the case,
pues
we could
podríamos
choose one or the
combinar
other, right?
una u otra, ¿no? ¿Vale? Voy
I'm
a
going to
pasar ahora a
move
la
on now
parte
to the cloud part, okay?
del cloud, ¿vale? Para enseñarle un poco un overview
To show
general
you a general
de esta
overview
parte.
of this part.
Si
If
entramos,
we
pues nos
enter, it
va a
will allow
permitir
us to access the different modules we have available.
acceder a los diferentes módulos que tenemos disponibles, ¿vale? La sección
Okay,
principal
the
sería
main section
consola de
would be the
administración,
administration console,
¿vale?
where we'll
Donde
see
vamos a
that we
ver
have a
que
menu on the left
tenemos
where
un
we
menú
have the
en la
different
parte izquierda
operations and the last
donde tenemos
executions
las
that have been
diferentes
carried out.
operaciones y las últimas ejecuciones que se han realizado, ¿vale?
Okay?
En este caso,
In this
pues
case, well, we were doing
hemos hecho
tests,
pruebas, ¿vale?
okay?
Son fallidas
They
en
are
entorno
failed.
de demo,
A
pero aquí
development environment,
lo que
but
decía
here
serían
what we
nuestros
would have would
procesos,
be our processes.
¿vale?
The
Lo que
ones
hemos
we've
diseñado con
designed
la
with the
herramienta de
studio
estudio que
tool
les
I
comentaba.
mentioned,
Aquí
this
esta
would be
sería
the
la
photo
foto
where we have the
de los
different
diferentes
components
componentes,
threaded together to
entre sí,
create a data
para crear
integration
un
process
proceso de
and, well,
integración de
a
datos
small application.
y, bueno, pues una pequeña explicación y cuándo
And
se ha
when it was
ejecutado, cuál ha
executed,
sido la
what was the
duración,
duration,
cuándo ha
when it
acabado,
ended, and so on.
etc. ¿vale? Luego la parte
Okay, then in the
de
management
gestión
part,
lo que vamos a
what we're
tener
going to
sería
have would be within everything we've
dentro
published in the
de
cloud.
todo lo que hemos publicado en la nube, pues podemos acceder de
We can
manera
access
individual
each of its
a cada uno de sus
components
componentes,
individually.
¿vale? Y de nuevo podemos
Okay?
ver en qué
And
consiste ese
again, we
trabajo
can see what this
y
work consists of
añadir
and
una
add a
tarea
task that would allow us to execute this process.
que sería la que nos permitiría poder ejecutar este proceso,
Okay?
¿vale? Bueno, podemos rellenar de
Well,
manera
we can
opcional
optionally fill in
con
some
información, incluso
information, even
taguearlo
tag
para que
it,
luego la
so that
búsqueda sea
later
más
the search
sencilla,
is easier.
¿vale? Elegimos
Okay,
motor de
we choose
ejecución,
the
¿vale? En este
execution
caso tenemos
engine.
disponible el cloud,
In this
un poco
case,
lo que
we have the cloud
comentaba antes
available, a bit of what I
motor
mentioned
de
before about
ejecución,
execution engines,
el
the
nivel de
level of
log
log
que
detail
queremos,
we want
de
for the
detalle
execution so
de
that
la
when it
ejecución
runs we
para
can
cuando se
trace it.
ejecute podamos hacer una trazabilidad. Y
Important to
importante el
schedule
programar
how
con qué
often we want
frecuencia
to run
queremos
it.
ejecutarlo, ¿vale?
Okay, a
Un
task
programador de
scheduler,
tareas, ¿no? Para
right?
que se ejecute de manera
So that it
automática cuando
runs
nosotros lo indicamos.
automatically when we indicate it.
Y nada, aquí si
And
lo
well, if we
ejecutamos,
run it
y ahora
right
vemos que
now, as I
ya
already have it
en
in a
ejecución
previous
previa, pues me va a dar un
execution,
error,
it will
pero
give me
sería
an
una
error.
manera
But
de
well, that
ejecutar
would be the way to
el
execute the
proceso
process and
y
schedule
programar.
it.
Vale, voy a
Okay,
volver de nuevo
I'm going
aquí.
to go back here.
Eh, Luego en la parte
Then in the
de
projects
proyectos,
section.
aquí
Here,
los
in
generamos, lo que
general, it's
comentaba, trabajar con
recommended to
Git,
work
de
with
manera
Git,
que
so that,
si tenemos
if we have
un
a
trabajo
collaborative work
colaborativo, pues
environment, we can have
podamos
a
tener
continuous integration process with Git and
un
our
proceso
projects.
de integración continua con Git y con nuestros
We can
proyectos.
apply the Git
Podemos
flow
crear metodología
methodology,
Git
for
Flow, por
example,
ejemplo, que
which is
también
also
es
recommended.
recomendable,
It
¿no? Que
can be
puede
a
ser
good
una
practice
buena
for us.
práctica, ¿vale? Proceso para crear los
Process to
diferentes
create the
engines,
different engines or
motores
execution engines that I
que
mentioned.
comentaba.
Being
El
able to
poder tener,
organize
¿no?
the different
Organizados
work
los diferentes
environments
entornos
and
de
workspaces
trabajo
where
y
we'll organize the
los
different
workspace,
projects.
donde vamos a organizar los diferentes proyectos. Tenemos
We have almost
capacidad
immediate capacity to
de manera
promote,
casi
that
inmediata de
is, to move
promocionar, de
from
que
one
pasemos de un
environment
entorno a
to
otro, de
another, from
desarrollo
development to
a
pre-production,
producción, por
for
ejemplo,
example,
¿vale? De
right?
manera sencilla,
Easily we
el
choose the
entorno
source
Git
environment and the
y el
destination
entorno
environment, and
productivo
all
y
those artifacts that we already
todos
have
esos
published
artefactos que
in that
tenemos ya
environment
publicados
would migrate to
en
the
ese
other to
entorno se migraría a
facilitate the
nosotros, ¿no? Para
deployment.
facilitarnos ese despliegue. Luego
Then
la
the
parte
user part where for
de
each
usuario,
user we
donde
can add a
cada
user and
usuario
define what permissions
podemos
they
definir el
have or what
usuario y
they can do
definir
within the
qué
platform.
permisos tiene o qué puede hacer dentro de la plataforma, ¿vale? Y luego algún
And then
módulo
some
adicional que
additional modules,
les
as I
comentaba, por
mentioned.
ejemplo,
For
el API
example,
Designer o el
the
API
API
Tester,
designer
¿vale?
or
Que nos va
the
a
API
permitir
tester that will
de una
allow us to
manera
easily create
sencilla
APIs.
crear APIs, ¿vale? Es decir, nos
That is,
permitiría
it would
añadir
allow us
endpoints
to
a
add
nuestros
in points
procesos,
to our processes.
¿vale? Aquí
Here we
tenemos
have some
un
examples.
ejemplo. En este
In this
caso, pues,
case,
para
well,
obtener
to
datos
get
de
people's
personas, ¿no?
data,
Un
a
GET, un
GET, a
POST,
POST,
¿vale? Para
typical
acceder
API
simplemente
operations
con
that
la
we can
API
design from Talend
que
itself,
podemos diseñar desde el propio Talend, incluso
even
probar
test and work with it,
y
okay?
trabajar con ello. ¿Vale? Ese sería
That would be
el
the
API Designer
API
y el API
designer and the
Tester
API tester
de manera
similarly.
similar, ¿vale? Una vez
Okay, once
diseñado
we've designed our process, it
nuestro
even
proceso, nos
allows us
permite
to
incluso crear
generate
escenarios,
scenarios.
¿no? Pues un
Well, a
escenario donde
scenario where I create a
creo una
person and make
persona
a
y hago
GET
un
to get
get
all those
para
created.
obtener todas las que haya creadas, ¿no? ¿Vale? Son
Okay,
escenarios
they are
donde
usage
podemos
scenarios
encadenar
where we can
diferentes
chain
acciones,
different
utilizar
actions with our API,
ejecutarlas y probar.
execute it,
¿Mm?
and test it.
Entonces, bueno, bastante
Well,
útil
quite
para,
useful
como
too,
bien les
as I
decía,
was
luego
saying,
añadir
add on point
endpoints
of our
dentro
process
del
and
proceso
facilitate that
poder facilitar
communication
esa
between
comunicación
applications.
entre aplicaciones, ¿vale?
And then
Y
about the
luego sobre la
cloud.
nube,
The
el
last one
último que
I'm
voy a
going to
comentar,
comment on is
porque el
this
resto
one,
lo vamos a
because
ver
we'll see the rest
más
later.
adelante, pero
But this one, the
el
data
data inventory,
inventory
lo que nos
will
va a
allow us
permitir
to define a dataset in
pues
the
es
cloud
definir un
itself,
dataset en la
okay?
propia nube, ¿vale?
Define, add
Añadir dataset,
dataset. We give it a
ponemos
name.
un nombre, establecemos
Establish a connection that we have
una
available or add
conexión,
a new
¿vale?
one.
Que tengamos disponible o le damos a añadir una nueva. Elegimos
We
nuestro
choose our
engine
engine
y
and the
el
type
tipo
of
de conexión y
connection.
como pueden ver,
And
pues
as you
aquí
can
tenemos
see, here we have the main
las
connections.
principales conexiones, pues a
to
bases de datos,
databases, to
a
clusters,
clústeres,
and so on,
etcétera.
even to
Incluso
Kafka if we have any
Kafka
queuing process,
si
and so
tenemos un
on.
proceso
And from here,
vinculado, etcétera. ¿Vale?
what
Y
we
desde
can
aquí
also
también
do
lo que
very
podemos hacer
easily
es,
is
de manera muy sencilla, poder
to add a
añadir
data set.
un dataset, ¿vale?
We would add it
Aquí
here. We could give it a
podríamos darle un
name.
nombre. Bueno, esto es
Well,
lo que hemos
what I
creado
showed
antes, pero
before, but
añadido
add a
aquí, ¿vale?
file,
Que era
right?
a lo que
That was
íbamos.
what
Y
I
aquí
was
pues
going to do.
voy a elegir alguno de
I'm going
ejemplo,
to choose one of the examples, a simple one.
uno sencillo,
Okay,
¿vale? Un
a
archivo
file. It's
se
being
está
uploaded,
subiendo,
okay,
¿vale? En
in
este
this
caso
case, a
un
CSV
archivo
file
CSV, ¿vale? Y va a
will
hacer un
sample those
muestreo de
data
esos
and give us
datos y nos
some
va a dar
indicators
una
about the
serie
data
de
quality.
indicadores sobre la calidad del dato, ¿vale?
It will
Tardará un
take a
poquito
little while to do it,
en
and it can
hacerlo
serve us as an example
y nos puede
to get an
servir,
idea
pues,
of what the data
como
quality is, how we could improve it.
un ejemplo, ¿no? Pues para hacernos una idea de cuál es la calidad del dato, cómo podríamos mejorarlo, ¿no? ¿Vale? Mientras se
Okay, while
sube,
it's
vuelvo a los
uploading, I'll go
datasets
back to the
que
data
hay
sets
antes,
that were there
¿vale? Este se está
before, which
subiendo.
are still being uploaded.
Y también
It's here.
podemos hacernos una
And we
idea
can
de
also get an idea of
los
the
diferentes
different data
datasets, la
sets,
calidad que
the
tienen,
quality
¿vale?
they
Pues
have,
algunos que
right?
tengamos ya
Some
creados
that we
previamente.
already have previously created.
Nos da
It
una
gives
serie
us
de
some
métricas
metrics of the
sobre
usage it's getting,
seleccionando la
data
validez del
validity,
dato, la popularidad,
popularity,
etcétera,
etc.
y lo
And we can
podemos
assess
valorar,
it,
¿vale? Es
okay?
decir, pues decidir
That is,
si
you
ese
can
dato
decide if that data seems more or less
es
good so that
más
other
bueno o
users
menos
can get
bueno
an
para que otros
idea.
usuarios se puedan hacer una idea, ¿no? ¿Vale? Y aquí tendríamos
And here we would have an
un
example of what
ejemplo
that data set
de lo que
contains, and
contiene
even
ese
based on the
dataset,
fields that we have defined,
e
it tells
incluso en
us what the
base
valid
a los
values
campos que
are.
nosotros tengamos definidos, pues nos dice cuáles son los valores válidos, ¿vale?
Okay,
Tendríamos un
we have a
5,6% de
5.6%
datos
error rate,
erróneos,
okay?
¿vale? Dentro de la
Within the
codificación del
phone
teléfono
encoding, and
y un
94% are
94%
correct,
correcto.
okay?
Entonces, bueno, pues nos
So,
puede
well,
servir para,
it can serve us
como les
to,
decía, ¿no?
as
Pues
I was
tener
saying,
una idea
have an
inicial de
initial
nuestro
idea of our
dataset.
data set.
Vale, ya se ha
Okay, this
cargado
one has
el
already
último
been loaded. The
que
last
había
one that I
subido
had
antes de
uploaded from the
CSV.
CSV, and
Pues
well,
aquí
here we have a
tenemos un
sampling of
muestreo
that
de
data.
ese
Okay,
dato, ¿vale? Entonces,
so
pues
it's
entonces
what's
lo
called the
que se
data
llama
inventory,
el Data Inventory, que
which
sería un
would be
lugar
a
donde podemos
place where we
poner
can
nuestro
have our
dataset
data sets
centralizado
centralized and any
y cualquier
user who
usuario
has
que tenga aquí
access to the
acceso al dato
cloud,
pues puede
well, can view the
ir
data,
viendo
and
el dato.
even more
Incluso se pueden
advanced
hacer
things
cosas
can be
más
done,
avanzadas, ¿vale?
as
Como
we'll see
veremos más
later,
adelante, ¿no?
okay?
Eh, vale, pues me voy
Okay,
a pasar a la parte
well, I'm going to move on to the data
de
management
gestión del
part.
dato, luego volveremos
Then
a
we'll come
la
back to
parte
the cloud
del
part when
cloud,
we do the
cuando hagamos
example.
el ejemplo. Vale,
Okay,
aquí
here
tenemos
we
una
have a
serie
series of images,
de imágenes, ¿no? Que al
which
final lo
ultimately
que presenta es
represent
que
that.
pues, los
Well,
datos
the
no
data
son
is
tan
not
buenos
as good as we might think.
podemos pensar, ¿no? Por ejemplo,
For example,
78%
38% of executives,
de los ejecutivos pues les
well,
cuesta
they have
tienen
difficulties when
dificultad, ¿no? A
making
la hora
decisions.
de tomar decisiones. El
60% don't
60% pues
trust the
no
data they're
confían
working with.
en los datos con los que están trabajando, ¿vale?
Okay? Then here
Luego aquí
regarding the
respecto a las
source from
herramientas
Gartner,
de Gartner, el 75% de los data
75% of
lake
data lakes
no
never
llegan
make
a
it to
producir,
production.
¿vale? El concepto de
Okay?
data lake muy
The
extendido,
concept
¿no?
of
Muy
data lake,
recientemente,
very widespread
de poder
recently,
tener
of being
un
able to have a
historial
data
de datos
repository to work with.
con los que trabajar. Y
And
luego el
then 80%,
80%, pues a
well,
la hora
when
de
applying that business
aplicarle
value to it,
ese, ese negocio, ¿no? Ese valor de negocio, pues no
well,
son
they're not
lo
what
que
we might
podríamos esperar.
expect.
Vale, entonces,
Okay,
bueno,
so well,
para
for
ello,
that,
pues si volvemos
if
un
we
poco
look
la
back
vista
a
hacia
bit,
atrás, ¿no?
right?
Tradicionalmente,
Traditionally, we would have the
tendríamos
model
un
where
modelo
very
donde
few
muy
people
poca
access a
gente
small set of
accede a un
data, right?
pequeño conjunto de datos, ¿vale? Que sería el enfoque que teníamos
Which would
unos
be the
años
approach
atrás
we had a
que
few
todavía
years ago, but it
se sigue
still extends
extendiendo,
to
¿vale?
what we could
Sería lo que
call the
podríamos
old
llamar
data
el
model,
viejo modelo de datos, ¿no? Donde
where
tenemos
we have
nuestros
our
modelos
traditional data
tradicionales de datos
warehouse
enrevesados
models, and in
y al
the end, the
final
number of
el
users
número
who
de usuarios que le
benefit
sacan
from it is
partido es
very limited,
muy limitado, ¿no?
right?
Luego
Then
esto, pues
this
bueno,
was
fue
extending, and in
extendiéndose
the
y
end
al
we can
final
establish a sequence where we have the
el,
raw data.
podemos establecer una secuenciación, ¿no? Donde tenemos el dato en bruto,
Then on that raw
luego sobre
data,
ese
we
dato
do
en bruto
processing,
hacemos un procesamiento,
ingestion
¿no?
of
Ingestion
certain
de
data,
los datos, operaciones
operations to apply
de chequear
quality
de
to it,
calidad, gestionarlo,
manage it,
que
and
sea
make it
consumido,
consumable.
pero como vemos
But
aquí,
as we
pues bueno,
see here,
consumido
well,
por
consumed by more
perfiles
specific
ya
profiles,
más específicos, ¿no? Pues
data
científicos de datos,
scientists,
analistas,
analysts,
usuarios de
operations users.
operaciones, ¿no? Vale, ya vamos
Okay, we're
extendiendo el
extending the
uso de
use of data
datos
to more members
más
of the
miembros de la organización.
organization.
Pero al
But
final
in the end, what is
lo que
intended
se
is to make
pretende es
everything
pues,
simpler.
que sea todo, digamos, más sencillo. Y bueno, aquí teníamos
And
a
here
los
we had
trabajadores
workers by guilds, so to
por
speak,
gremios, ¿no? Por
separated,
decirlo de
and
alguna
what is
manera,
wanted
separados.
is for them to
Y lo que
communicate
se
with each
persigue
other.
es que se comuniquen entre ellos, ¿no? Es decir, que cualquier
That
usuario
is,
puede
any
intervenir
user
en el
can
gobierno
intervene in data
del
governance.
dato, ¿no? ¿Vale? Sería el
It would be the
modelo
model that is
al
tended
que
to
se
reach and
tiende
that, well,
a
would bring
llegar
us
y
the
que, bueno,
most
más
benefits because it
partido se le
involves
puede
all the
sacar
profiles of the organization.
a todos los perfiles de la organización, ¿no? Es difícil de
It's
conseguir, pero
difficult
bueno,
to achieve, but
sería el que
well,
más
it would be the
beneficios
one that would bring
nos
us the
aporta,
most benefits.
¿vale? Y al
And in
final lo que
the end,
vamos a
what we're
tener es el
going to
concepto de
have,
health.
the concept of data health.
¿Cómo
How can
podemos
we
aplicar
apply
eso,
that data
proceso
health process,
de
to
salud
improve that
al
data?
dato, ¿no? De mejorar ese dato, pues aplicar
Well,
medidas
apply
preventivas,
preventive measures.
¿vale? Es decir,
That is,
tener,
have,
digamos,
let's say, a plan where we can say,
un
well,
plano donde
if data
podamos
of
decir,
this
pues
type
bueno,
is
si se
produced or reaches
produce, nos
us,
llega un dato de este tipo,
how
¿cómo
are we
vamos a
going to
abordarlo?
handle it?
¿Quién
We
le
should
debe
validate the data.
validar el dato? ¿Vale?
All
Todo
that
ese
kind of
tipo
work
de
plan,
plan
have
de
it
trabajo tenerlo
defined.
definido. Y sobre todo también
And
muy
above all,
importante el
it's also very
extenderlo dentro
important to
de la
extend it within the
organización, ¿vale? Es
organization.
decir, inculcarlo y que
That
sea
is,
algo
instill it and make
que
it
no
something
solo
that is not only
se
said to
dice
be
de hacer,
done,
sino
but
que
also
también
done, and for that,
se hace.
it's key to have
Y para
monitoring and a
eso,
series
pues,
of visual
clave
elements that allow us to
tenerlo en
analyze it
comunicación
and report on that monitoring.
bueno, una serie de elementos visuales que nos permitan el analizarlo, ¿no? Y hacer reporting de ese seguimiento. ¿Vale? Aquí tenemos,
Here we have,
pues,
let's say,
digamos que
5
5
pillars
patas,
within
¿no?
a
Dentro uno
maturity model of this
de madurez
concept of data health.
de este concepto de data health. El data
The data
driven, ¿vale?
driven.
O cómo nos está ayudando ese
How is
dato
that data
a
helping
tomar
us make
decisiones,
decisions,
considerar
considering
el dato
data as an
como un
important
activo
asset
importante
within
dentro de
the
nuestra
organization?
organización, ¿vale?
Data
Inclusividad del dato,
inclusivity.
todos
All
los
employees
empleados
have
tienen
access
acceso
to the data.
al dato, cómo se está
How is
trabajando
data
con el
being
dato y
worked
buena
with? Is there
comunicación,
good communication?
¿vale? Incluso aplicar
And even
políticas
apply
de
quality
calidad para
policies to
prevenir
prevent
ciertos
certain
valores erróneos,
erroneous
descartar
values
aquellos
and
que no nos
discard
interesen.
those that are not of interest
Entonces,
to
bueno,
us,
pues serían
right?
como
This would be
cinco
like
elementos
5
importantes
important elements
dentro
to
a
consider
valorar
within a
dentro
data
de la
maturity
madurez del
model.
dato. Y
And
luego
then
si
if we
diferenciamos
differentiate between
entre calidad
data
del dato,
quality,
confianza
trust, and
y
this
este
health
modelo
model,
de health, pues
well,
aquí
here we
podemos ver
can
un
see a bit
poco
the
clave de la
areas of the
organización
organization or
con
the
los tres
3
pilares
pillars on which it
existentes,
is
¿no? La calidad
based.
del dato va muy
Data
enfocada al
quality is
dataset.
very focused on the dataset.
Dentro
Within the
de
company's
lo que es su
operational
operación
process,
de la compañía, ¿vale? Al
in
final
the end,
lo que
what
va
will
a
result is
redundar
the
es la
trust in the
confianza
data,
del dato. Y luego los
and then the
5
5
conceptos que
concepts we saw
veíamos previamente,
previously,
pues
well,
son
they are
clave
key
dentro
within the concept
del
of
concepto de
organization,
organización, ¿no?
right?
Entonces,
So,
bueno, pues
well,
dentro de la
within
calidad
data
del dato,
quality,
pues si ese
if
dato es
that data is
certero,
accurate,
consistente,
consistent,
tiene
has
trazabilidad en el
traceability over
tiempo,
time.
dentro de la
Within trust,
confianza, el
the
uso
use
que le
given to
da
the
al
data,
dato, la
its
popularidad que
popularity,
tiene, si se
if
está
it's being
haciendo
used, right?
uso de él, ¿vale? Entonces, bueno,
So,
todo
all this
esto al
ultimately would
final
be 3 pillars to
serían pues
consider important in terms of data
3
governance.
pilares a tener en cuenta importantes en cuanto al gobierno del dato. ¿Vale? Dentro de
What does
Talend, ¿qué nos
Talend
aporta?
provide
Pues
us within that?
podemos
Well,
sacar
we can extract,
como
as we
veíamos
saw
en
in
el
the
módulo
data
de data
inventory
entry, uno
module,
de ellos nada
which would
más,
be
¿vale?
one
Que
of
nos
them,
permitiría
but there are more. But
hacer
that one
un
allows
chequeo de
us
esos
to do a
datasets.
check of those data sets. It's
Recomendable
advisable to
hacer
do a
un
detailed
dry
assessment of
assessment,
those,
es decir,
that is, to
tener
have all those
recopilados
data assets collected
todos
and then
esos
have an
datos
action plan.
y luego
right?
tener un
Well,
plan
to see what to
de
do in each
acción, ¿no? Pues
case,
para ver qué
right?
hacer en cada caso, ¿vale? Y luego a
And
nivel
then
de
at the definition
definición,
level,
pues
well,
de uso
regarding
del
data
dato, pues
governance,
no nos
it
viene a
tells us
decir
no more than
más
it's,
qué es, digamos,
let's say, the
el método
method
que
that
nos
will
va a
allow
permitir
us to
definir
define processes,
procesos,
norms,
normas
and
y
policies to work
políticas
with
para
it, with the
trabajar
data, right?
con el dato, ¿vale? Aquí hay
There are
diferentes
different
frameworks
frameworks
en los
on
que nos
which we can
podemos
base
basar.
ourselves.
Hay uno
There's
bastante
a
conocido que se
well-known
llama
one
DAMA,
called DAMA,
nosotros, bueno, pues
which we usually
solemos
have
tenerlo
as a reference.
como referencia, ¿vale? De hecho,
In
tengo por
fact,
aquí
I have Manuel here
un
like an
manual
encyclopedia of
como
this
de una
program, which is a
enciclopedia,
quite
¿vale?
thick book and well,
De
it
este
can serve
DAMA, que
as
es
a
un libro
reference
bastante
for us.
bonito y bueno, pues nos puede servir de referencia. Y luego dentro
And then within Talend,
de Talend, pues tenemos las
well,
herramientas
we
que nos
have the tools
permiten
that allow us to make
el
that
hacer
definition
todo
model,
ese
okay?
modelo de definición, ¿vale? Definir nuestro
Define our
glosario
glossary of
de
terms,
términos, tener
have our semantic map,
nuestro mapa semántico, ¿vale?
our
Con
data
nuestros
patterns,
patrones de datos, tener
have our
nuestro
MDM,
MDM,
our
nuestro
master data
repositorio
repository.
de datos maestros, ¿vale? Entonces, si nos
Okay,
ceñimos
so if we
a un
stick to a
framework que es el que
framework
nos
that is the one
recomienda
recommended to us,
pues buenas
well,
prácticas
best
y
practices and
procesos
processes to
a
follow,
seguir,
then
pues
within
en resumen
Talend,
podemos cubrir
we can cover those
esa
definitions they
definición
recommend.
que nos recomienda, ¿vale? Una de,
One of the
de las
features,
características que
as I
comentaba
mentioned,
es
is the MDM,
el
which would
MDM,
be the
que es el
repository where
repositorio,
we
¿no?
will
Para
have our
tener
master
nuestros
data.
maestros de datos y
And it will
nos va a
allow us
permitir
within all
dentro
our
de todas
sources to
nuestras
define a
fuentes pues
single data,
definir
right?
un dato único, ¿vale? Es decir, que
That
si en
is,
una
if
fuente
in
se
one
llame de una
source it's
manera
called one
y en
thing
otra
and in
otra,
another it's
pues
called
nosotros lo
something
vamos a
else.
olvidar y
With
vamos a
this we
decir,
will
pues no, se va a
consolidate it
llamar
and we will say,
siempre
no, it will always be called
de
this
esta
way,
manera,
right?
¿vale? Y
And
dentro
within that data
de esa
management,
gestión del dato, pues obviamente aquí se involucran
obviously different
pues
areas are involved:
diferentes áreas, ¿no? Pues la
architecture,
arquitectura, el
data
diseño del
design,
dato, cómo lo
how we're
estamos
storing it,
almacenando, qué
what
seguridad,
security,
qué
what
usuarios
users
pueden
can
ver o
see or
no
not see the
el dato,
data,
trabajar
work
con
with
él,
it,
cómo
how
se
they
comunica los datos
communicate the
entre
data
sí,
among themselves,
dónde
where the
se
data
está
is
haciendo
being
uso
used, what's
de
the
esos
quality,
datos, cuál
etc.
es la calidad, etcétera. Y el
And the
elemento
main
principal
element
que
that
hay
allows us
dentro de
within
Talend
Talend to
de
apply data
aplicar,
governance, I
incluido el
say the
dato, digo el
main
elemento
element
principal
because there are
porque hay varios,
several.
¿no? Pero uno de ellos
But
sería
one of them would
el
be the
Talend
Talend data
Catalog,
catalog,
que
okay?
es el que nos va a permitir
That's the one that will allow
trabajar
us to work with this
con
whole
todo ese dato.
flow, and it's mainly composed
Y se
of
compone principalmente de una parte
a client
cliente,
part,
una parte
a server
servidor,
part, a
una base de
database
datos
where
donde
we
vamos a
will
almacenar
store all
todos
the
los
metadata,
metadatos
and
y
servers
unos
where we will
servidores donde vamos a
collect all the
recolectar toda esa
information.
información.
That's at a
Ese
high
sería
level of that architecture
el
component.
grandes rasgos de ese componente de arquitectura. ¿Vale? Y a nivel
And at the
de
level of main
características
important
principales,
features,
importante,
it
nos va a
will
permitir
allow
el
us data
linaje
lineage.
del dato, ¿vale? Es decir, de dónde
That
ha
is,
salido
where it
y
came
dónde lo
from
estoy
and where I'm
utilizando.
using it and what I've previously
¿Qué
done
he
with
hecho
it.
previamente con él? Pues si lo he
If I've
agregado,
added it,
si lo he
if I've
combinado con
combined
otro
it with
dato,
another data,
en qué informe lo
in
estoy
what report
utilizando.
I'm using it.
¿Qué
What
pasa si
happens
lo
if I
cambio?
change
¿No?
it?
¿Dónde afecta? Es decir, si yo
Or
cambio
it
ese
affects
dato,
if I change that data,
¿dónde me
or
va a
it will
afectar?
affect me.
¿Vale?
Okay,
Pues
so
todo eso
all
con
that
esta
with
herramienta
these
nos van a
tools will
facilitar
facilitate us that traceability.
esa trazabilidad.
And security is
Y
important,
importante
right?
la seguridad, ¿no?
To
Es
give each
darle
role,
a cada rol, pues,
well, the
pueda
ability to
trabajar
work with those data that they can and those
con
they
aquellos
can't,
datos que pueda y lo que no pueda, pues no darle permiso, claro.
well, don't give them permission, of course.
¿Vale?
And well,
Y bueno, estas serían unas
these
imágenes
would be images of the
de
interface that will
de
allow
la
us,
interfaz que
from
nos va
this
a
form,
permitir,
to
pues,
operate
eso,
and work and
poder
define
operar
all those data
y trabajar
policies.
y definir todas esas políticas de datos. ¿Vale? Tiene una
It
parte
has a
muy
very
visual
visual
también,
part,
¿vale? Lo que
too,
se llama
what's
stitching
called
metadata,
stitching
que al final,
metadata,
pues lo que nos va a permitir
which in the end will allow us to
es
detect,
detectar, por
for
ejemplo,
example,
ambigüedades
ambiguities among the
entre los
data,
datos,
right?
¿no?
And
Y si
if we have
tenemos procesos
processes where
donde
there are
haya
different
diferentes
relationships
relaciones entre
between
ellos,
them.
pues poder ver el impacto de una manera
Well, to be able to see the
muy
impact
visual,
in a very
¿vale? Si
visual
tenemos varias
way.
fuentes de datos, varios ficheros,
If we
etcétera,
have several data sources,
pues
several files,
de una manera
etc.,
muy intuitiva podemos
well,
hacer
in
una
a
idea de lo
very
que está pasando.
intuitive way, we can get an idea
Vale, y
of
aquí
what's
ya
happening.
no voy a entrar porque
Okay, I
se lo voy a
won't go
dejar
into
a
this
mi
anymore
compañero
because
Raúl
otherwise
sin
I'll leave
tiempo,
my colleague
¿vale? Del
Raul
Data
without
Preparation
time for
Enterprise
data
Stewardship.
preparation and
Raúl, te
data
dejo para que lo
stewardship.
cuentes,
Raul,
para que lo
I'll
cuentes
leave it
tú,
to you to tell,
¿vale?
okay?
Así que
So,
te cedo
I'm
ya
handing
la
over the
palabra.
floor to you, okay?
Well, so I'm now going to explain a little bit also in a summarized way, a use case in which we're going to use Talend Studio. I'm sharing my screen. Okay, so here mainly, sorry, we're going to work with a demo in which a series of data based on Formula 1 is used on circuits, races, different teams, right? So in this case, we're working with the enterprise version. It's a paid version of Talend Studio. This is the tool with which we can perform all this data transformation, this data integration also that is carried out in the different processes. And in this particular job, we have different data sources that we see here on the screen. We have on one side a CSV file, a JSON file, and a database in which we have a series of data about the circuit. I think it is in this case. Okay, we're also going to make use of the components that would make the calls to the data preparation and data stewardship, these two here. In the first case, we're going to make a call to a data preparation in which from the Talend Cloud, we could decide what we want to do or what transformations we want to perform in our data or what kind of operations. So, I'm going to share my screen now of the data preparation. Just a moment. What Raul showed previously would be the design environment, the working environment, and that once developed is published in the cloud, which is what we're showing now. That's it. Here, in this working environment, in this development environment, right? Well, we have a part where we would have different components, right? That the tool provides us with, which are numerous. As we can see, there are many already developed specifically for certain databases or for certain technologies. In these components, they are local components, right? That we simply connect to a series of files that we have in our local repository. And we do a union of these components, right? Of the output or the data we have from these components. So, well, in the part we have here, in the Talend Cloud, we would have this data preparation in which we would establish the connection with one of our databases that, as we can see here, we would be using a MySQL database, right? In this case, we would connect from the data preparation to the connection established in that job, right? In that data transformation, which then we would also have to establish the data set, as one showed before, that we wanted to connect in this case would be the data from the Formula 1 demo, which is what we are working with today, what we are in this demo. What is used? Well, like before, we can see the accuracy or the validity of each of the records. And finally, we would have that preparation. This preparation is done as an example in this case, but it could be specific for each of the different cases of the different objectives that we want to achieve with our transformation or our job from Talend Studio. Here we can see how we would have our dataset, and we could decide on different operations to perform on this data. All of this can be done both from Talend Studio, from this tool. That is to say, here we also have components that will allow us to do all these transformations, right? Combinations of data. And then also from here, from the cloud, we can perform different operations, as we can see here, like changing the data type, renaming data, reordering data. We can also replace certain streams. We have different operations. As we can see here, to be able to delete certain rows based on objectives, mask data, avoid duplicates. Well, a series of operations or tasks that are called from Talend preparation, in which automatically every time this preparation is called, right, as we are actually doing here in Talend, in Talend Studio, automatically. Through this component, we decide to call this preparation, right, that we already have generated in the cloud, and then every time this job is executed, the results we are going to obtain from this preparation, well, they will all be determined by us, right? All tasks or those phases that we want this data to go through. So once this first part of the job is executed, we would simply have different sources that we are going to do is combine them, merge them, right? Of these sources based on their keys and based on their common data. Then in a stage area, in an intermediate area where we store all this data so that we can return to, let's say, to be able to use it again later without having to resort to this data loading from the source again, to be able to make everything more dynamic and faster, well, we would have this area. From here we call this once all this has been done in a correct way that we do not receive any error. What we do is call this data again, and through a tmatch group component, which in this case is a component that allows us to use different algorithms to decide what data, or what set of data, what records we want to accept for our final objective, and which ones not, right? There are different types of algorithms that we can choose based on the characteristics of our dataset or our data set. So on one hand, we will get all those data that we do accept, and we will send them to our database with which we are working from the beginning, but to a different table where we are going to have the results, and where we want to have only those valid data or those data cleaned and transformed previously. And through this algorithm, we would obtain both the data that we do not accept and those data that can give or give a case of doubt, right? We can say those data would be maybe, in which if we decide that our data have a certain size, belong to a certain group, these data do not meet those parameters, but they are not rejected. So what we can do here is simply make use of a business user, an end user, or one or several, right, who is responsible for deciding on this data. For this, what we are going to do is send this series of data on which we want to make decisions as end business users to data stewardship, right? So from data stewardship, what we are going to achieve is to call the cloud service, as we have seen before, which would be the next step after data preparation. It would be this data stewardship. Well, okay, so here too, we would connect to our data model, create a campaign, right? That a campaign is basically a unit of work that allows to configure the different objectives that are wanted to be achieved on the data. That is, we can tag, there are campaigns of the type, to be able to merge data, to be able to group data, to be able to decide which data are accepted and which are not. So, in this case, we generate a campaign for our specific dataset, and here a business user can define, just like before, a series of tasks so that another business user in charge is responsible for deciding on the different records. That is to say, for example, since we are dealing with Formula 1 prize data, here we would have the dataset, right? In this case, the field of circuits or the names of the prizes. So, for example, if we decide that the names of the prizes should be a bounded name, a short name, then a business person who knows the data well, right? Who knows what the real objective is, the final objective, the objective that is being sought with this series of transformations and this series of data integration, right? Then we could decide which data we want and which we don't. That is, in a more manual way, right? Since a priori the dataset is fine, it's just that maybe it exceeds the limit here, or in this case of nationality, we only want to accept, well, a series of values, right? We want to accept those that are Italian or American. As we can see here, we can see in the number of records, we can see the patterns they follow. So if we wanted to accept Italians, Americans, but also occasionally wanted to accept some other prize, well, all of that would have to be done by a business person who is responsible or who really knows these data very well and could make decisions about them. So, ultimately, this end user, or this final business user, is the one who decides which records and fields he accepts from a dataset, which has been previously transformed, cleaned, and treated, and it has been decided which ones, a series of records, and which ones are accepted, but another series of records give rise to doubt, or it is preferable to review them in order to accept or not in their final objective. So, through this data stewardship, well, we can generate all these campaigns or all these tasks, right? Which would be the same as we were commenting, so that the same user or several can make decisions about this data, right? So, well, we run it to see the results. Well, here we would have the Talend Studio console. As we mentioned, it's the main development tool. Here we would have the different connections, the different metadata, because we can automatically connect to data sources that we are constantly using in our project, that we are accessing them recurrently. And as we can see, well, it's running. In the first case, it extracts the data from our CSV, then it extracts the data from our JSON. As we can see, we can also extract them on the screen thanks to this component, the tlog row, which we could use to see all our data to make sure we are not making any mistakes. And in this case, we connect to our database, send the data, and call our preparation. This preparation has filtered and performed all those tasks that we had previously defined in the Talend cloud. In these steps here, all these tasks that we have defined here would be what has been applied to that original dataset. Subsequently, we join this data, right? As in this component that we can see here and from this state area. It's an intermediate task area where we store the data to be able to resort to it later. Well, we would be doing the same as before, deciding with this algorithm, this T-match group that allows us to apply different algorithms to sift through that data. So we get different outputs, as we have seen. On the screen, we see the rejected data. We could also access our database to see which data has been accepted, and then the rest of the data that we want to analyze or that we want to make decisions about. We send them to this data stewardship. Alternatively, in this case as well, in this demo, the option is chosen to obtain a record of this data from which a decision has to be made about them, so that subsequently if the decision made about a set of this data was erroneous or correct, well, we could act according to our objectives and our needs. Well, the configuration of each component, we could see it here in this part, right? Here we would be configuring each component from Talend Studio of the tool. Here, as we can see, we connect to our cloud account, call the preparation that we have previously created, and so on. So, well, what we are going to do now is, as you have seen, In a somewhat general way, this tool to be able to get in touch with it. We sent you an email earlier this morning for you to download Talend, the Open Studio version of Talend. So now we are going to access it, and we are going to create a simple example, right? Connecting to Salesforce, which is a common client or a common technology to use and is used in different projects. And we will connect to a trial account from which we will extract a series of data and perform a series of joins and transformations on them.
I don't know, Rubble, if before that we can show the stewardship, I mean the requests that may have reached that user? Right, so a little here what they can see is that 3 different profiles have intervened, right? It's a profile, the developer, the data integrator, who is the one who works with the Studio tool, then a user profile that doesn't need to be technical to, with data preparation, define which fields to work with. And then that data judge, that steward, who will be in charge of those records that we don't have security on, and if they are correct, then decide which of them is finally to be applied, right?
That's it. Here, we could be deciding as end users, right? Which data we want to validate or which ones we want to create a task for, in order to be able to decide on the final set, right? Okay, so well, we move on to the exercise then, right? To the exercise to follow, right? To see. Well, I'm going to show you first the data that we are going to use in this case. We are going to connect to a Salesforce account that we have as a demo. We will basically work with 3 profiles that would be the account profile, the contact profile, and the case profile, right? That we see here. And with all this data, well, we are going to do a small guided example. So, well, the first thing would be to open Talend Open Studio. You would have to generate a new project, right? An empty project, a new project. It's in progress. I don't know if the rest of you who are following us already have it open.
Estamos viendo, bueno, Raúl, ahora la ventana
Ujú.
de Salesforce.
Vale, sí, un momento que...
Sí, está
Yes,
cargando.
it's
Nada,
loading.
bueno, lo que
Well,
decíamos
what we were
antes,
saying before, if anyone has prepared the tool to follow the example, they can do it on the fly and ask any questions, right?
sobre la marcha y preguntando cualquier duda, ¿vale?
Exacto, al final es
Exactly.
para tomar un poco de
In the
contacto
end,
con
it's to
lo
get
que
a
viene a
little
ser la
bit in
herramienta
touch with what the Talend Studio tool is,
de
and
Talend
as well,
Studio, y
as
como,
one
bueno, como ha
commented,
comentado Juan,
you can
se
see
puede
that there
ver
are
que hay
different types of
distintos
users,
tipos
right?
de usuarios, ¿no? Al final que
Ultimately
trabajan
working in different
distintas
phases of this
fases
data
de
integration
esta
or data
integración de los datos, de esta
transformation,
transformación de los datos, en la cual
in which
todos
all the
los
gears are important.
engranajes son importantes. Vale,
Okay,
está terminando
the
de abrirse
project
ya
is
el
finishing
proyecto, ¿vale?
opening
Vamos a
now,
crear
right?
un nuevo proyecto.
You create a new project.
Vale, bueno, de
Okay,
momento,
well,
os
for
muestro
now
aquí
I'll
el
show you here the
objetivo
goal we want to
que queremos
achieve,
conseguir, ¿vale?
right?
A través de nuestra,
Through this new
a través de
project, right?
de este nuevo
What we are
proyecto, ¿vale?
simply going to do
Simplemente
is
lo que vamos a hacer
connect
es
to these 3
conectarnos a
different
estos
components
distintos
that we have
componentes
seen
que
in
hemos visto
Salesforce,
en Salesforce, ¿vale?
right?
Que
Which
se
correspond to
corresponden
these
entonces aquí.
ones here.
Y una
And
vez
once we
que,
connect to them,
que
well,
nos
we
conectamos a ello,
extract the
pues extraemos
information,
información,
right?
¿vale? Y en
And in
este
this
caso en un
case,
Excel
in an
con
Excel with
distintas
different
hojas,
sheets,
vamos a
we will store
almacenar
this
esta
information
información de
temporarily,
manera temporal.
so that
Para
later
luego
on,
después, pues podemos
we
seguir
can
con el
continue with the
ejemplo,
example by
haciendo un
joining
read de
these
estos
Excel
Excel y
files
volviéndolo a subir
and
a
uploading them
Salesforce,
back to
o podemos hacer
Salesforce,
distintas
or
operaciones
we
con
can
ellos.
perform different operations
Entonces,
with
bueno,
them.
ya lo tengo
So,
aquí abierto.
I have it open here now. If
Si
you
me
are
vais
following
siguiendo, pues
along, that's better.
mejor. Lo primero,
The
bueno,
first
sería
thing would be to
crear,
create
sería
would
crear
be
un
to
job,
create a
¿vale?
job,
Con el
right?
botón derecho creamos un
With the
job,
right
le
button, we create a
llamamos
job, give it a name.
Un nombre.
In this case, we are going to do a data reading. So if you want to name our job by this name, okay, here we have the canvas where we can start establishing all the components. But the first thing we are going to do is create a context. Creating a context allows us to access or use its component or its different calls in a recurrent way, in a much simpler way. That is, we are going to establish the credentials we are going to connect to and not have to be constantly setting these things up, repeating, right? If we are already in a big project, we don't have to continuously repeat the same connection, for example. So, we are going to create a variable, a series of general variables. We are going to call them Talend. Right, and here in Next, we are going to add this series of parameters. This series of variables in which we are going to use the data that we have provided you by email, right? In that email, you had both a user and an account, and a password, and a token. So I'm going to copy mine. Okay. In this case, we are going to put here the username, for example, of type string. Then we are also going to create a password. We are going to create a token. And in this case also, well, to facilitate, as we are going to work with different local files, we are going to create a path, right? A file path. In this case, we declare it as a password type, the password and the token as well to have greater confidentiality and security in this, the data entered automatically. So we are simply going to add the data that was provided to you by email, right? And then we are going to provide a path. Okay, this way we could also create different environments, right? For example, a development environment and a production environment, right? So we could set it as default, and in that way, we would simply be deciding when we are here working on our job, right? When we want to use our job, we could use, here select one environment or another. So, okay. Here what we do is drag the context so that in our previously created job it remains in it. And here if we had several contexts, right? Several development and production environments, for example, well, we could have the different days, having selected the different options. Okay, here we see what is to be used by default. They are the variables that we have established. So, well, similarly, we are going to generate the necessary metadata for the development of this exercise. First, we are going to start with a connection to Salesforce, right? We give it its name, and just like before, we enter the user that has been provided to us. The password and the access token. We test the connection.
Bien,
Okay,
vemos que es
we see that it
exitoso.
is successful. And
Y
now
ahora a
next,
continuación
we
tenemos
have
que
to select
seleccionar
those components or those
aquellos
use cases
componentes o
that we are going to use.
aquellos
In this
casos de uso que vamos a
case,
utilizar. En
they
este
are the
caso son las
accounts,
cuentas, contactos y
contacts,
casos
and
de
cases of
Salesforce.
Salesforce. So from
Entonces,
here,
desde aquí
we
podemos
can
seleccionar
select
cuenta,
account. Okay,
cuenta,
account,
contactos y casos.
contacts, and cases.
¿Vale?
Right,
Cuenta,
account,
contactos.
contacts.
Vale.
Okay, we select those three components,
esos tres componentes. Y
and
como
as
vemos
we
aquí,
see
ahora ya se
here,
nos ha añadido nuestra
now our
conexión,
connection
y
has
en
been
la cual
added,
tenemos nuestros tres
and in
metadatos
which
ya
we have our
establecidos.
three
Bueno,
metadata
aquí
already
de manera
established,
automática,
right?
al conectarse a ellos,
Here,
establece
automatically, when
su
connecting to
esquema y
them,
establece,
it
en este
establishes
caso,
its
las
schema
columnas que cada
and
uno de los
establishes, in
componentes de
this case,
Salesforce
the
tiene.
columns that each of the
Esto
Salesforce
lo que nos va a
components
permitir
has.
tenerlo aquí definido
This
en
is what
nuestros
will allow us
proyectos,
to have it
es que de
defined here in
manera
our
recurrente
projects,
podemos acceder
that
a
we
él.
can access it
Simplemente, por ejemplo,
recurrently.
con el account,
Simply, for
si
example, with the
simplemente lo
account,
arrastramos a nuestro
we
lienzo,
simply drag
podemos
it onto our
seleccionar cómo
canvas.
utilizarlo. En este caso
We can
queremos
select how to use
ver
it.
los datos de
In this case,
estas cuentas,
we
¿no?
want
Datos
to read the
de
data from these accounts, right?
Salesforce. Entonces
From
lo que vamos a hacer
Salesforce.
es seleccionar el
So what we are going to
Salesforce
do
input.
is select T Salesforce input.
De
From
esto
this same
esto
thing
mismo
that
que
we
hemos
have
hecho
done
de manera
automatically
automática
here,
aquí, pues
well,
podríamos hacerlo
we could simply
simplemente
do it by
añadiendo
adding a component called T Salesforce.
un componente que se llama T Salesforce, ¿vale? Que vemos
Which we
aquí,
see
input.
here, input.
Entonces, si no
So,
lo tuviéramos aquí
if we
definido
didn't
en
have
nuestros
it defined
metadatos,
here in our
cada vez que
metadata,
le añadamos
every
este
time we
componente, por
add this
ejemplo, de
component,
cuenta, habría que
for
aquí establecer
example,
nuestra
for an
ID, nuestro
account,
password.
we would have
Es
to
decir,
establish
nos
our
está
ID,
evitando a largo
our
plazo, nos
password
está
here,
evitando
that
bastante
is,
trabajo.
it is saving us a
¿Vale?
lot of work in the
Entonces, al
long
igual que
run.
hemos añadido
So,
este de
just
aquí,
like
vamos
we
a
added
añadir
this
los
one
otros dos
here,
casos
we're
que
going to add
tenemos.
the other two cases we have.
Bien. Y
And
lo
first of
primero de
all,
todo, aunque ya hemos
although
probado
we
que
have
la
already
conexión es
tested
correcta,
that the
vamos a
connection is
establecer una
correct,
conexión en
we
nuestro
are
job.
going to establish
Para
a
ello,
connection
vamos
in
a
our
utilizar un
job.
componente
To do this,
tprejob.
we are going to use a
Este
component,
componente lo que nos permite
tprejob.
es ejecutar
This
antes de
component
hacer
allows
nada en
us to
este job,
execute,
aquel
before doing
componente al
anything
que
in this
vamos
job, that component
a
we are
enlazar.
going to link it to, right?
Queremos crear
We want to
una
create a
conexión con
connection with T
Salesforce,
Salesforce.
entonces simplemente
So we
arrastramos la
simply
conexión,
drag the
en vez de uno
connection
de los
instead
casos
of one
sería
of
la
the
conexión,
cases, it would be the
y vamos a
connection.
hacer un T
And we are
Salesforce
going to do a
connect.
T Salesforce connection like this, yes, yes,
De
with
esta
the right
manera,
button
si
trigger
con
or a
botón derecho
component.
disparador o un componente
Okay,
POC, lo
the
primero que vamos a
first
hacer
thing
en
we are
este job
going to do in
siempre es
this,
establecer esta conexión.
since it is
Como
always
vemos,
to
ahí estaría la
establish this
conexión y
connection,
una para,
as
porque
we
en el caso de
see,
que tengamos
here
varias
would be the
cuentas o
connection,
tengamos
and
distintos
one so that in the case we have
componentes
several
homónimos de
accounts or
Salesforce,
have
pues nos
different
podríamos
components
conectar a
or
ellos,
modules of
se
Firefox.
podríamos,
Well,
¿no?
we could connect to
evitar
them.
errores gracias a
We
esta
could
conexión.
avoid errors in this
Simplemente
connection.
conectarnos al
Simply
objetivo que
connect to the
tenemos.
target we have.
Bien,
Okay, once
una
we have
vez que hemos
created the
creado los
inputs,
inputs, ¿no?
not
Los
that we
hemos
have configured
configurado,
them
como en
as in
este
this
caso ya lo hemos
case,
hecho aquí
we have
previamente,
already done here
es
previously,
mucho más
it is
sencillo.
much simpler.
Ahora
Now
lo que
what
vamos
we
a
are
hacer
going to do is add a component to be able to extract,
añadir un componente
to
para
be able
poder
to save
extraer,
our
bueno,
data
para poder guardar nuestros
temporarily.
datos de manera temporal. En este caso, vamos a
In this
optar por
case, we are going to
componente,
opt for
¿vale?
an output component.
Que sea
Okay,
para poder
to be able to store it in
almacenarlo
an
en un Excel.
Excel. So,
Entonces,
we are
vamos
going
a
to define a
definir
fail output.
the file output. ¿Vale? ¿Veis?
As you
Como
can
veis,
see,
tenemos
we have different options here,
distintas opciones aquí. Y
and we are going to
vamos a optar
opt
por
for
el Excel.
Excel. Okay,
Vale.
simply
Simplemente,
with the
pues,
main,
con
we
el
are
main,
going to make it so that when
vamos
we
a
read the
hacer
account
que
data, it
desde
doesn't write
cuando
them in an
leemos los datos de la
Excel,
cuenta,
that we are
nos
going to.
escriba en un Excel, que
That first we are
primero
going
vamos
to
a configurar
configure
aquí.
here how to
La
configure
manera de
it.
configurarlo va a ser, vamos a
It will
añadir
be, we are going
nuestro
to add our
context
context for text.
context.
What
Esto
we
lo que
do
hacemos es llamar
is
a
call
nuestra
our
variable de
context
contexto que hemos
variable that
generado
we
aquí
have
con nuestro
generated here
contexto.
in our
La
context.
hemos
We have
llamado
called it
file
find,
y le
and
vamos
we
a
are
dar
going to
un
give it a
nombre, ¿vale?
name
A
to
nuestro
our
fichero.
file. we are going to say we are going to make it the type of x.x, and in this case, we are going to say that it is saved in a sheet, not that it is called account. So we can use the same Excel for the different components. We want the first one to be created to respect the header that this file has. We say yes, because so in case this file exists, it will be added to it. And as we see here, we would have all the columns that our file would have been extracted from our previously generated metadata.
Desde nuestros metadatos, ¿vale? Que hemos generado previamente.
And we will also have this option checked so that in case we don't have the file created, it will be generated for us. Okay, just like we did here, we're going to duplicate in this case the component, because we're going to do the same thing we do with the rest of the cases. It's important, just like we want our work to follow an order, right? Respect an order. In this case, we want that once the accounts have been written in our Excel, the cases continue to be written, and then the context we don't believe that it is done either in parallel or that it doesn't follow an order, so as not to know where we are having a fault. So to do this, simply right-click instead of triggering as we did before, where we connected to main. Now we use on subjob OK. This means that this subjob here, this part, once it is executed and gives us a success message, we will start with the execution of the next subjob. In the next case, we do the same and configure the two Excel components that remain. In the first case with the cases, and in the second with, well, I put cases, and in the second with a contact. Okay, once the schema, like in this case, this button here allows us to synchronize the columns, that is, to obtain the schema of the component that precedes it to save it in the component we are working with. Since what we have done is duplicate a previous component, which was this one here, the schema it had saved from this component is the previous one, but it is not the same as the one corresponding to this account. This component here, this Excel, does not have the same schema as the previous one, because it should correspond to the schema of the case that I made. For this, simply with this button here, Sync Columns, we have to make our schema that we had previously change to the same one we have in our input component. Well, here we can see it. Look, in this case, if we see the first one, the schema as we see here do not match, okay? But if, however, we use the sync column and edit schema again, the component matches exactly. Then we save our job to be able to execute it and launch a first execution of this job to see if everything we have done is correct. As we can see, by default we use the credentials we have established. We are asked if we want to apply the update of these credentials here, and we accept. Well, if you have any questions or anything, you can stop me and ask me. Okay, here it throws us a warning, okay, that there is no need to worry. It is because of the type of component we are using from Salesforce, and as we see here, in the first case 14 accounts have been written, 26 cases, and 20 contacts, exactly with the example account we were working with. So we can see here that there are 14 accounts. The contacts are the same, the cases too, okay? Than what we get in our job. Okay, once we have done this, we are going to go to our path that we have established in the context. And from here, we are going to be able to see how a new file has been created for us. In this case, in Excel. in which we have the expected output. As we can see here, we would have the first sheet account. As we can see here, we would have the first sheet account. In the second sheet, we would have the cases, and in the last sheet, the contacts that correspond exactly to the ones we had previously. So you can see that in a very simple way, we can access different technologies or interfaces, obtain data from them, and be able to merge them, work with them. You can also perform some operations. For example, if we want to clean data or adjust some parameters, it could be done perfectly. In this case, for example, if we want to change the type of this column, right? We want to put a type, a Boolean, right? A type 1, 0. Well, you could make it true, false, instead of having a field that is a string with a complete word. All of that we can do from here from Talend Studio, although it can also be done, as we saw before, from the Talend Cloud from data preparation. So well, let's continue if you want. If you don't have any doubts with A.
Raul, I'm going to tell you to leave a little time for any questions and so on. Count so very roughly in a minute, 2 minutes. What the complete example was to get an idea without going into detail, but also to leave it commented.
Okay, yes. It was about continuing a bit, right? To continue making a series of transformations on this data. Here, for example, we had prepared a case in which what we do now would be to connect to this Excel that we have created with the different sheets, make a join of the data, and simply normalize this data. That is, if we wanted to work with the normalized data, instead of having to work with these three modules, we could work with just one directly, simply by joining our data that we have in that intermediate area, that temporary area, right? Which would be that file. We would do a join in which, as we see here, we simply connect. Through it connects, or the union is made through the determined fields that allow the union between the IDs or between the contacts, IDs, and the account IDs, and we would finally extract the fields that we wanted from each of the different modules, right? And in a simple way, well, in this case, if we execute it, we would get. Well, we would have to close this Excel. Okay, well, to do it quickly, and not to stop anymore, we would simply get that same Excel in which we had three different sheets, well, a single sheet with all those normalized data, right, with all that data joined, and then, well, another series of examples that we could continue doing in this exercise would be to connect directly to Salesforce and make this data union and transformation and be able to work with them, then directly from data preparation or from data stewardship directly without having to resort to files, right? Say local files or intermediate files. And well, I don't know if you have any doubts or everything we have been telling you. In the end, it's a bit of a process in general, but we could.
Before any doubts. Sorry, Raul, I was going to share here, so that, well, as it is always good to have as a reference some client or some specific sector where it is being used where within the Talend website. Well, we can choose by product, right? If they are API projects or creation of endpoints or data preparation, applying quality policies, etc., or by industry and within the industry, well, we could choose a specific sector and we could access cases where it has been applied and the improvements that have occurred when using the technology. Well, it is always good to be able, within the market, well, to know a little what is being done, and it can give us ideas of how to apply the technology. And well, as my colleague Raul mentioned, the idea in this time that we have left, if there is any question or doubt that we can clarify, well, now would be the time.
Juan, a question that several clients here in Peru have expressed to me. What difference can we find between Talend and Pentaho?
¿Qué diferencia podemos encontrar entre Talend y Pentaho?
Well, I understand that Pentaho in terms of the PDI integration tool you mean?
Sí, exactamente.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, well, both versions, both Talend and Pentaho have in terms of licensing, right? They have the community version and by saying open and the licensed version. But let's say that the main advantage of Talend over Pentaho is that we can cover what the data integration process, right? We can also apply certain data quality policies, but at the time of all that process, well, the data, as I mentioned before, applying data quality policies, defining masters, business rules, all that will be provided to us more completely by the Talend suite, right? Trying to address a data governance project with all that implies with PDI, right? Would be, say, a very manual process compared to what we could do with what Talend already provides us, right?
Another question that we also had here from some friends at Renique is that, can Talend work perfectly with Oracle?
¿Talend puede funcionar perfectamente con Oracle?
Yes.
No hay problema.
Yes, perfectly. Regarding all those connectors that I mentioned before, around 700 of them, well, you can perfectly work with Oracle, yes.
Perfecto.
Well,
No sé si de
perfect.
los compañeros que están
I don't know if any of the
en línea
colleagues
alguna
online have
pregunta.
any questions.
Adelante, por favor.
Go ahead, please. Carlos,
¿alguna pregunta
any
tuya?
questions from you?
No, from my side, it's quite clear. Especially, I don't know if Juan could mention or show, if it's available, a list where we can see the connectors that are available.
Yes, let's see. Within the Talend help, which by the way is quite comprehensive, right? Well, here we could search for a specific component and well, it gives us help on that component and generally it is accompanied by a scenario, with a use case where it is applied, right? But then at the component level reference, well, here we have a guide for 6.3, but from here we can navigate to 7.3, which is the latest. Okay, let's see if here. Let's search better for 7.3 to have a more updated version. Okay, well, here, for example, we have classified, right? Well, for example, if we go to what they asked before about Oracle, right? Well, we would have the different operations that we can do with Talend and components. Right? Well, to make a commit, to make a connection. It is accompanied by a scenario, generally, right? And definition. So well, it's at this URL, for example, we have all the components for different versions, right? Of Talend, the latest stable one is 7.3, 8.0 has just come out very recently, right? ND we can also choose the components by products, right? Filtered for a specific Talend product depending on whether we have a project of type ESB, MBM, or the type of project we have, right?
Yes, also look, if you want I can share a moment of the screen with you. There's also one here. Sorry. Let me see. Now, here also, in Talend Forge, you can see all the components if you want to see them more specifically. Let's say, you could see all the components grouped by each engine, right? For example, for OpenStudio, if we want for data integration all the components that are allowed, right? For big data, for business intelligence, for everything. If you want to see them a bit more classified, better or
Sí,
more
más clasificado
classified? Exactly.
conceptual. Sí.
Yes. Well, if you want to search for a specific one to see how one of them works, it can be seen from here, or for the version that is available, because of course, not all components are also available for all versions.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions, colleagues? Well, Raul, Juan, all I have left is to thank you very much for the kindness you have shown us in giving us this webinar. Would call it a masterclass. To all the colleagues, we will send them documentation from Talend about the webinar given by Raul and Juan. And well, thank you all for your participation.
Y bueno, agradecerles a todos la participación, recalcar nuevamente que
I would like to emphasize again that with Strataby Business Solutions, in Spain, we are a gold partner of Talend, and that also in Peru we can serve you without any problem through Talend, with our strategic partner control
a
system.
través de Talend con nuestro socio estratégico que es Control System. Así que
So I hope this
espero que
webinar has been
ustedes
very
disfruten
helpful
mucho
to
de esta
you, and we
webinar
are at your service.
y quedamos a la orden de todos ustedes. Raúl,
Raul,
Juan,
Juan,
muchísimas gracias.
thank you
Espero
very
que
much.
este año tenerlos por Perú
I hope to
y
have you in
también por
Peru
México.
this year and invite you to a good
Eso
pisco.
tomamos
So if the
nota.
project we're thinking of goes ahead,
Así que
consider it done,
aquí
okay?
sale el proyecto que estamos
I won't take
montando
up any more of
solo
your
por eso.
time, so you
¿Ok?
can watch the
No les
game.
quito más tiempo. Espero
Real
que
Madrid seems like my
para que vean
brother.
el
I don't know if
partido
Raul, who are you
Real
a fan
Madrid,
of?
Paris
Eso,
Saint-Germain. No sé si
exactamente.
Raúl, de quién eres hincha vos? Del Real Madrid o del Atlético? Del Real Madrid, espero que gane, entonces ahí va. Muchas gracias a todos, muchas gracias
Pues nada, lo dicho,
Juan, muchas gracias Raúl.
agradecerle la asistencia y nada, que le invitamos a probar la herramienta y que seguro que en alguna pieza de la organización le puede encajar.
No, de hecho que sé que van a haber de aquí muchas preguntas con los compañeros que han estado
No,
asistiendo.
in fact, I know there will be many questions here from the colleagues who have been attending, and we will be communicating internally, right? Thank you all very much. Thanks, Carlos and Juan. Please send us this video. We'll upload it to the control system website so they can review it, and we're available for any clarification about the tool, okay? Thank you, Take care. Come on, greetings to everyone.
Venga, un
Warm
saludo a todos.
regards.
Gracias.